There we go.
Well, welcome everybody, and I am so glad to be here. It's really an honor to see old friends and meet some new ones, and hopefully today's topic will kind of give us a little bit more hope and guidance and understanding, and perhaps a little bit more empathy. But I'd kind of like to start off instead of an introduction to who I am, is to kind of tell you a little story about what happened this past summer that really is relevant into how I see communication and as a key to developing a bridge to each other. I was asked by a student to come together with him and present on racism in small town or rural America, and it was right in the middle of the different protests that were going on with Black Lives Matter, and so we did not know how we were going to be received. My student had asked me to come and talk to his community on racism, and so I volunteered, and I drove up to this small town north of Tulsa that was known as a sundown town. And for some of us who don't know what a sundown town is it's a town that has traditionally been hostile to minorities.
Mm.
And so we didn't know the reception that we're getting, but we decided that it was important as was an important topic because he was one of the few African American males that lived in the town, and he was starting to feel the pressure of what was happening in Tulsa and other cities. So we drove up there together, and we met at the park in a gazebo. And when we first arrived, we saw a couple of police cars just kind of circling around, and we looked at each other and said, "Okay, we're in this together. We don't know how it's going to end, but we're going to have a discussion. We're going to have an open and honest discussion with the people of your town." Well, a few minutes later, the mayor showed up, the city manager, town executives, and it was a small crowd, but it was a decent sized crowd. And the discussion started off beautifully. And I must admit, it kind of took the student and I by surprise, but we're rolling with it. But as the evening progressed, one of the persons in the audience reached out and asked my student Wayne, said, "How do you deal with racism?" And I was sitting next to him, and I was listening to him, and I heard what he was saying. He was basically saying that I've dealt with racism for a long time. I've just developed a thicker skin. And that comment just shot lightning bolts to me, through me, I'm sorry, excuse me. And I had to stop everybody for a moment. And I said, listen to what Wayne just said. He deals with racism by developing a thicker skin, a stronger resolve. And I said, do we not see the obscenity in that? How we're asking another human being, because of our prejudice, our bias, our aggression, to develop a thicker skin in going through life? And it on the surface, it makes sense. But when you look at it from a psychological perspective, how dare we ask another human being to develop a thicker skin about our issues in life, about our prejudice, about our bias? And so that is a good segue into understanding that that words matter, that feelings matter, and that as we communicate with each other, sometimes, and a lot of times, and I should say this, okay, I'll be real straightforward. Words matter. And if you don't think that words can hurt or cause a person to develop a thicker skin, then we're failing each other. And so when we talk about microaggression in communication, what we're really talking about is how everyday exchanges can send degrading messages to people in a subtle but hurtful nature. And we're asking people to develop a thicker skin after a 400-year experience of oppression that still hasn't been totally addressed in our nation. So, what we're asking today is to kind of take our defenses down a little bit and listen to some concepts about what other people feel on a day to day basis. So, when we talk about microaggressions, which is the topic of today's conversation, we're talking about verbal and nonverbal behavior centered in on other people. And sometimes it's automatic and unconscious, but it's still biting. And so basically this is a form of oppression that is carried out in everyday interactions with each other that hits psychologically. Again, developing a thicker skin is not something that we should take lightly when that becomes how that person has to interact on a day to day basis with those around them. So I was looking for some reference points to really come up with a better framework when we're talking about race. And I came across a book called So You Want to Talk About Race. And it's a really beautifully written book about some basic understandings about how race in communication affects others on a daily basis. So there's some basic rules that the author threw out to us. One of it is that um, we can't expect others to accept our feelings about life and our life experiences if we don't accept their understanding about life and their experiences. In other words, a lot of times white America does a good job of putting out this beautiful liberal facade that they're understanding and they're working and making a great stride, but we fall into this trap of our own biases even with our good intentions. And sometimes we get defensive when we start talking about topics such as race, white privilege, and microaggressions as if we're divorced from it because we have good intentions to create a better or more harmonious world. But yet our biases can sink in and our expectations sink in when we start having to deal with the realities of other people's feelings. So basically, the author comes up with some ideas. One of them is if it's about race, it is about race, excuse me, it is about race if a person of color feels it's about race. In other words, if my neighbor feels that it's about race, then I should never negate their feelings towards it because it's their feelings. How dare I project my feelings or my interpretation of their life experiences if they feel that they have been discriminated against? It's about race if it disproportionately or differently affects people of color, her words. It's about race if it fits into a broader pattern of events that disproportionately or differently affects people of color. So, in other words, when you want to talk about race, you first have to practice empathy. You have to understand and listen to the pain of another person and their life experiences. So some of these basic rules of emotion and feelings doesn't mean that white folks don't have feelings also, or their feelings are not valid or real, especially if they're lived through. But we can't project our interpretation, our prism onto others unless we have a deeper understanding and a relationship with each other. This doesn't mean that classism is painless or doesn't exist. But we have all heard that old story. Well, there's a lot of poor people in Appalachia. There's a lot of poor people in other parts of the country that are white that are struggling. But what we forget to see is that added layer of racism or sexism or whatever that other people have to navigate that white folks usually don't have to deal with on a day to day basis. They're not judged by their color of their skin when they walk into a store and have to purchase something when the security guard is following them around. They don't have that concept of driving while black, working while Hispanic, or flying while Arab, and have that bias creeped into that cognition of others on a daily basis. Again, we have to understand that classism exists, and that's really about rich and poor, and it crosses all sorts of different categories. But when we add race to the concept, it adds another veneer that we're asking people to have to navigate. So we have to understand that these contemporary forms of oppression are real. They're there. And so the first thing that I try to do when I'm having these discussions is ask people to suspend their defensiveness, to just listen for a while. I'm not attacking, we're not attacking, we're just dialoguing. We're just trying to have a level of communication so that we understand that how words do matter. And so there are contemporary forms of racism or oppression that still exist today. While overt acts of racism is declining, the rise in hate crimes are climbing. In other words, while there isn't the overt acts of racism that our grandparents or our parents had to go through, we do see a rise in specifically targeted groups that are around that are being targeted now at higher rates than they had been over the last 10 years. And a lot of the rhetoric that we're hearing from our leadership mimics this. When we are giving that quiet nod to stand by, we're basically saying to these groups that, wait a minute, we'll call you out as we need you. And this has an effect on people. My friend who lives in that small town, he has to navigate that on a daily basis. Who's an ally? Who's a friend? Or who's a foe? And if you think about that, another layer of burden that person has to deal with emotionally or psychologically on a day-to-day basis. So covert racism, sexism, or isms exists today. And even though we have legislated or have passed legislation to protect folks, it's very difficult to legislate feelings. And those folks that have those feelings are still involved in policing, education, healthcare. And these subtleties really play out in the interpersonal relationships that people face on a day to day basis at work or in their communities. Adverse racism, obviously, is that the definite individuals that are consciously asserting egalitarian values but unconsciously hold anti-minority views is that bias that we talk about. They may be sympathetic, they may have an understanding of past injustices, like, oh my goodness, what happened to our indigenous population in this country was horrible, but that was 200 years ago. And sometimes you forget that although those things in our history books have faded in a lot of our memories, it's still played out in our institutions, in our approaches to how we look at others, the resources, and a variety of other different areas that even liberal Americans sometimes forget that these are things that we could fall back into our whiteness or our liberalism on a day-to-day basis, but in reality, this anti-minority view our this bias that creeps into our thoughts can be as detrimental as adverse racism or open racism. So basically, people who say, "Oh, I'm not prejudiced. I have, fill in the blank friends," may not realize by that statement alone, or "I don't see color," that statement alone negates that level of feeling and understanding that their friends have. Because again, in conversations, you really don't get into the meat of things about how these microaggressions, how these biases creep in to how we interact with each other at work, at school, or at play. And we also know that unfortunately, these negative feelings kind of fester and fester and fester, and it does slip out in our day-to-day realities. Sometimes they can be taken on at work by the diminishing of accomplishments of work. In other words, you know, where, oh, you got this job because you're a woman. Oh, you got this job because you're a minority, negating totally their academic achievement and their prowess. And so these things, again, our language, our microaggressions, may not seem as overtly racist, but they have a feeling to that person that's receiving them as if it was overt. I've had a lot of my students say, look, you know, I'd rather deal with somebody walking down the street with sheets on their heads than this systematic racism that I feel by not getting a promotion, by making less than my colleagues, by always having to justify my educational status or my educational prowess or where I went to school. You know, a lot of times, if you're going to a professional, we see this in our counseling field, there's always this question, are you competent? You know, because if you went to an HBCU, we get, I see this all the time played out in Tulsa in the interviews of different counselors in different mental health agencies. They look at which school that my graduates are coming from, and there's always that question mark because some of our students came up through the HBCU system. And you know, any of us who has worked, you know, Dr. Kandu could, you know, testify. His students and their rigor will put up against anybody, any other school, because of, you know, the training, the expertise in those schools. But yet, that's kind of that perfect example what of a microaggressionism, because we have this bias towards, you know, which school you graduated from, and then you're always having to continuously justify and, you know, and rationalize how good you are. And so we see this played out in race. We see this played out in homo negativity or heterosexualism. We see this played out in sexism. We see it played out in a variety of different prisms that we really need to address as professionals. So racism is basically, according, is any prejudice against someone because of their race when those views are reinforced by systems of power. And I think that that last statement is extremely critical. When these prejudice are reinforced by systems of power, by quotas, by admission, by commission, by loans, by zip code management or redlining, these systems of power are just as devastating as the old Jim Crow type laws that existed, you know, up until the 60s. They still exist. Racism still exists. It's institutionalized. It's still harbored in a lot of people's minds. But if we believe that we're living in a post-racial society, we're only kidding ourselves. So when we talk about these things, we can't divorce the persons as well as the institutions that perpetuate them. So religious discrimination, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Catholicism, and you name it, any religion that isn't mainstream has this level of bias or suspect by mainstream cultures. And so again, we're always having to justify that our religious perceptions or beliefs are valid to us or are as just as important to us as somebody else's values or somebody else's beliefs. And so that again is another example how microaggressions play out in day-to-day life, even when we're talking about something as sacred as our own belief systems, or even if you are not a believer, if you're a decent person and you don't follow a specific faith, you're always having to question your goodness or your ability to be kind or your ability to, you know, to have values or morals. And so this hierarchies in these case systems within religion, within race, within all the other isms have a psychological effect on how we view each other. So ableism is another one of those isms, which a lot of us who are in the disability rights uh, movement really basically is something that we have not addressed as specifically as other civil rights. I mean, I remember Dr. Williams in at U of A would say to us, basically, while Rosa Parks fought to get the right seat on the bus, a lot of the people with disabilities are still fighting to get on the bus. And I think that we've come a long way. We're starting to see people with disabilities appear in mainstream media and in a lot more conversations. But then again, it's those subtleties or realities about then, okay, that's great. We're seeing them on TV, we're seeing them in commercials, but we're not seeing them represented in the workforce where they should be. We're not seeing them as represented in a lot of other areas of our lives to the proportion of 56 million Americans that they should be better represented. And so those, okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. So we see this played out in real time in our lives in our communities, and we haven't really finished continuously addressing that. Okay. So the evolution of isms, physical environments here can feel unwelcome and isolated, unsafe for people. There's no access for people with disabilities, and these isms are the realities that a lot of people have to face. Microaggressions could be subtle, unintentional, indirect, often occur when there are often other explanations. They represent unconscious or ingrained beliefs or attitudes. They can also occur when people pretend not to notice each other's differences. Again, going back to, I have black friends, so how can I be racist? Or I don't see color. These are things that, again, on the surface, may be perceived as, okay, that's just them. They're not really educated on the system. But how many times and how many layers does it have to take before it really has a toll on others? So there are three types. Microaggressions have three types: micro assault, or the blatant verbal, nonverbal, or environmental attack intended to convey discriminatory bias statements, name calling, refusing services, moving when a person sits to them. That's what we're used to seeing. In other words, that's what we're used to seeing on a day-to-day basis, in our media. And so we understand how assaultive that is for people. Now, micro insults are insensitivity, in other words, using the inappropriate language, opening doors for people with disabilities when they're capable of opening the door for themselves. When you question people's academic success, male versus females picked over for management assessments. These lists can go on and on and on, obviously, right? And so these are things that we have to consciously understand before we can help dismantle these systematic practices on a day-to-day basis. Micro invalidations, verbal comments or behaviors that exclude or negate or dismiss somebody's personal thoughts. And that goes back to that original, so you want to talk about race statement. When we dismiss another person's feelings, it really does hurt. I mean, again, if we practice empathy and put ourselves in another person's shoe, how does it feel when we continuously have our feelings, our relationship with the world minimized or negated based on my fear or my projection? In other words, when I'll give you a prime example of this. About a month ago, when the Breonna Taylor verdict went down, I knew my students were struggling. Even though I was on Zoom, I could see it in their faces. They were distracted, even though I'm always tangential anyways. They were distracted more than normal by my tangentiality. And I was sensing something. I was sensing that they needed to get something off their chest or have something addressed. So we spent the whole, actually, that whole week, all five of my classes, we spent talking through the Breonna Taylor feelings that people had from that verdict and from the summer with Mr. Floyd's death and from the summer and the weeks and the years before that. And at the end of each session, somebody would come to me, one of my students would say to me and say, thank you for validating our feelings. What happens is because their feelings have been devalued, devalidated by us, by powerful people for a long time, they bottle it up inside. And we all know what happens when we bottle our feelings up inside. You either fight or flight, right? They become so destructive that you it becomes part of your psychology, part of how you view yourself. So by having our students have that ability to express their feelings, their concerns, their ideas, it was an emancipating process for them. And at the end of that 2 hour class, they all walked away. I always at the end of all my classes, whether it's Zoom or not, I ask, what have you learned tonight? It's kind of like a mini quiz. And they express their feelings. They talk about how they see the things that we talked about in their own lives, and it becomes real to them. Well, those psychological thoughts, their feelings, really drove home this point about micro invalidations. When we negate others' feelings, when we say that we're colorblind to the world around us, when the world around us isn't colorblind, then we're failing each other. We really are failing each other when we don't see each other. There's an old African proverb, I see you. And that proverb is so important because what it really means is I see you, I validate you, and I value you as a human being. And what better way for us to interact with each other, for us to start communicating with each other, for us to start healing each other by not practicing those principles? And again, microaggressions are sometimes more difficult for people to deal with than overt racism because again, it's subtle and it's sometimes from people that you like. It's sometimes coming from people that your coworkers, um, you know, uh, unintentional or intentional. That's how bias creeps into this equation. And sometimes when people are confronted, when sometimes when whites are confronted with the engagement, they can become confused or defensive. So two important parts of this dynamic. They're real. These feelings are real. They're sometimes more cutting than overt racism because I mean, again, we've learned to be understand where that's coming from. And when it's friendly fire, it hurts. When you've opened up your friendship, you've opened up your relationship with somebody, and then are their bias creeps in. Again, it's an educational journey. It's a pathway. So, it's a two-way street to talk about it, to deal with it. But both sides got to understand that look, this is a real situation here, and it does have some cause and effect. So there's the class of social demographic realities. In other words, many white people do not understand that racism still exists. People of color sometimes, and again, I'm using that word from the text, sometimes perceive that whites are insensitive, excuse me, and enjoy their privilege. That sometimes like all these realities, bisexuality is dismissed because the reliance of science to defend homosexuality can't be both. We sat at a conference one time and I watched a young person bravely talk about how they transitioned and became themselves. And people in the audience, rehab people in the audience, were challenging that person's journey, saying it was against, religious principles. And it really blew my mind because I'm sitting here in a field that is supposed to be the vanguards of social justice, which we are supposed to be, and we're the ones that are supposed to be on the front lines fighting for justice, social justice for all people. It's not a political statement. It's a ideologically an ideology statement. In other words, social justice should be it's ingrained in the practice of the Rehabilitation Act. I mean, not the act, but in our code of ethics. But yet, I'm sitting in a conference where rehab counselors were attacking a person because they were sharing their journey with them. And so I had to, I basically stopped that and said, how dare we as a profession attack somebody else's journey? I said, they said, well, it's against the law. It's this, it's that. I said, you know what? If I fell in love with this woman next to me who happened to be black 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that was against the law. So sometimes laws are supposed to be challenged when the realities are wrong. Okay. And so my point is that we really have to find a way to open up this dialogue and communication because this polarization is not artificially it's not artificially it's not in our nature. No child is born prejudiced. This is a construct. And if we could construct it from birth, we could deconstruct it with our relationships. So basically, we have to understand that in order to start having this dialogue, white folks or majority folks have to really stop being defensive and listen. And I got a couple slides that will talk about that in a moment. So there's these realities. There's these things that are thrown in people's faces. The reality is that these microaggressions can be brutal and can be psychologically damaging because they can contribute to post traumatic stress, anxiety, depression, and self doubt. It goes back to that study some of you heard me talk about that we've actually had to regroup it about generational trauma in Tulsa from the 1921 race massacre. We're having to go back as uh, more people are coming out of the community that want to express themselves. So we didn't want to shut it down. So our numbers are growing, and it's going to be interesting because it's becoming therapeutic in just the interviewing process, which is kind of action research, right? To begin with. But the reality is we're starting to see now that people are trusting the principal investigators and they're coming out, we're getting more and more active participants, but the themes are still emerging, but they're pretty much the same. Please acknowledge our pain. Please acknowledge what we're going through, our suffering. Even though it's been 100 years almost, my grandparents went through this. And if my grandparents went through it, we went through it. And plus, we really still haven't addressed the systematic racism that caused this to begin with in the first place, right? And so these are real emotions, and this generational trauma, you know, we as a people cannot segregate these feelings from one group to another. We're asking people to get over a massacre that happened 2 generations ago, but we're not asking white folks to get over some of their trauma. We're still celebrating European wars and European victories and all this other historical things because that's part of our history. We erect statues for them. But when somebody starts talking about generational trauma or racism, oh, we automatically dismiss their feelings because it's too hard on us to digest our own responsibility. Or if we're saying, well, I wasn't there, no, but we're still benefiting from those systems. And you know what? It's still here. That's the reality. The things that people are facing that promote these racisms or these microaggressions are still in our institutions. And so we still are culpable for being part of these systems that are played out on a day-to-day basis. And so we're always asking people who feel the microaggressions. It's kind of like a catch 22. It's very difficult for them to come up with a way to confront it. Do I bring it up? What if I bring it up and I lose my job? What if I bring it up and is it going to be another personal attack on me, or they're going to minimize my feelings? So there's always compromise. We're always asking people who are victims of these microaggressions, going back to my original stories, to have to deal with other people's issues when it is their issues, not the person that's becoming victimized by that. We're always asking people to shoulder the burden by themselves. How much heavier of a yoke can we put on people that have already faced discrimination based on whatever ism that they happen to fall into? So the other part of it is how do we continue as therapists or as helpers to help a person validate their self and make sure that they feel that they have value. And then sometimes it's just basically a sanity check. Really, was that what that person just said? Was that a racial comment? Is what I'm feeling reality? And it goes back to that first statement. If a person who, if a person, a minority or a marginalized population, say it's racism. If a woman says it's sexism, if a person with a disability says, hey, it's ableism, don't negate their feelings without communicating and understanding and practicing a little empathy. So counseling, we could see there's some issues that come up, and that's where we see a lot of problems. Is that if you a person is going into a majority um, practice and they feel invalidated because of their feelings are not being addressed, or they want to talk about how racism or sexism or whatever ism affects them on a daily basis, and we try to out them or out um, I used to, and when we're dealing with, when I deal with people with chronic pain issues, I always tell my staff, do not try to um, disable your this out disable them. In other words, don't say, well, I had an L4-5 bulging disc. This is how I felt. That's the same thing. That's a microaggression towards somebody. You're comparing your experiences to theirs without understanding their experiences first. It's that the old self-disclosure. It's not appropriate to self-disclose your issues when you're dealing with people in your counseling session unless it's timed appropriately. But it's the same thing when you're talking about these microaggressions when we're talking about race. You can't try to always overcorrect or try to demonstrate your anti-racism or you're an ally until it's basically you need to listen. When I'm working with the folks in Tulsa on some of these issues about Black Lives Matter, and the last thing that I need to do is tell another human being how they should respond to systemic racism or systemic prejudice. I'm there to be an ally, to give my resources, my ability to do research, or my ability to do counseling as a as an accommodation, not a direction. Because again, it's nothing about us without us, and that's been the problem for a long time as us professionals try to define other people's lives based on our prism of things. So we have to understand the roots of bias and have an open dialogue and work to have this therapeutic alliance and relationship. We have to help explore the responses to life, understand that the amount of energy and cost to always doing so is it takes a toll on people. We have to teach appropriate responses to microaggressions. So here's kind of how I have approached it. I call it my pillars of caring. First of all, you have to practice compassion, caring enough to care. So I think the strongest thing that I try to do in my life to deal with, to help other people heal from systematic racism or oppression is basically care enough to care. Then I have to practice empathy, listen to the other stories, feelings, and ideas. They know the answer. They know how to fix things. We just have to help them in their journey as an ally, as a person that's when they say they need us, that's when we step up. Then the thing I try to do is instill hope. Installation of hope is real critical because then you can develop a trusting relationship to change the behaviors of self-doubt, of self-worth, and all those things that a person's struggling with when they're having to deal with racism on an ongoing basis. Also, because the ultimate goal is to reconcile. The truth and reconciliation, or truth and conciliation, is the end result of the process. You can't ask a person to forgive you unless you know what you're asking to be forgiven for. You can't. So this process of healing ultimately leads to the big ask. Can you forgive me? Can you forgive me as a person who has failed you through omission or commission to really address some of your feelings and how you are navigating life? And so by practicing these four pillars on a day-to-day basis, I try to model and lead by example that it can be done. We can develop these relationships and deal with these microaggressions or racism, overt or covertly. And so again, we talked about that from a counseling perspective. And so we try to be aware of racial, gender, and sexual orientation issues. We have to be aware of how everybody engages in the practice of microaggression. We have to engage in seeking relationships and discussion about how to avoid microaggressions in therapy. And these are discussions that, when we're having in services or our staffings with our therapists or even our colleagues, we need to bring these things up in a very in a proactive environment so we can kind of check ourselves and make sure that we're progressing as humans ourselves and that we're not hurting people by the continuation of practicing microaggressions. So addressing microaggressions starts with an understanding of our own bias and how they may be played out in our interaction. And then with this knowledge comes the commitment to change. So be the change that you seek, you want to see that you wish to see in the world. And I think that type of honest and open discussion, you're gonna trip over yourself. You're gonna say the inappropriate words every once in a while. Your bias is gonna creep in, whether it's whatever your bias is, it's gonna creep in. But it's how you address how it crept in and your willingness to change your behaviors based on more knowledge, more understanding, more empathy, more compassion, in the hope that we're all on the same page to create a better future. That's how you can begin these dialogues. Just like the dialogue in that little town up north, at the end of the day, at the end of that hour, well, actually, it was only supposed to be an hour, turned out to be a 3 hour discussion about racism in small rural America. We had a commitment from the mayor, from the town council, from the Chamber of Commerce to create a city that's welcoming to all people, regardless of regardless of religious practice, color of their skin. And there was a genuine interest after we got past some of the defense of this to make systemic changes. Now, people say that this can't happen, but if you walked away from that meeting like we did, Wayne and I walked away looking at each other and said, "What just happened here?" We went in there with a lot of fear and trepidation that we were going to be met with hostility, but we were met with a lot of questions. We were met with sincere effort to change the dynamics of a sundown city that still had a convenience store that flew the Confederate flag proudly outside. But you got to walk towards a better path. And so by having that dialogue, by addressing some of these aggressions, we talked about microaggressions, by talking about bias, it was a difficult conversation. But just think how difficult it was for the people that if we didn't have that conversation. So I think that's something to take away from today's talk is it's okay to have that conversation if it's coming from the heart. It's if you're acting out of love and compassion and you want to see systemic change, you got to be the person that starts that conversation. But remember, it's an evolution. It's a process. But like Martin Luther King said to LBJ, how much longer can we wait? You know, you want us to wait till it's politically correct to do this stuff. You're not the one that's suffering from this stuff. So my challenge to all of us is be the change that you seek, and if not now, when? It starts today with you. It starts today with examining what we just talked about for the however minutes, how many minutes we talked about it, and saying, okay, some of that I could get. I need to research some more of that. I really need to process this a little bit deeper. That's okay. That's the way it's supposed to be. This is a process. But if you care enough about thy brother in our universal, there's one thing that transcends every belief system. Do unto others as you have them do unto yourself. Every religious group, every moral fiber of our existence should be centered around how do we want to be treated? That's how we should treat others. And by doing so, you'll do the homework, you'll do the research, you'll be a lot more articulate than I am in explaining this. And I think by doing so, you won't believe the transformation of the people in your sphere of influence. You won't believe the people that you really start to form relationships and friendships and allies with. And then it becomes that chaos theory, that butterfly flapping in the rainforest, how this can then transform how we see each other on a day to day basis. Because if I can make my colleague's life better at the job, I've done my part. But if we don't address the elephant that's in the room and there's biases that creep in, then I failed to be a human to my friends and my extended world family. Okay. Any questions?
John, you made an excellent presentation and very timely presentation. It's very powerful. I think we should
Thank
have
you.
similar presentations all over the place. Then we're going to change. Yeah, people need to learn about it. We do not
Well,
think about it that deeply. That's the problem, you know.
I appreciate that coming from
Yes,
you
it
because
is. It is. It is
definitely,
very powerful. Very
well,
powerful.
I thank you. Coming from you, that means a lot to me.
Well, we all need to learn. That is true. And all need to
Yeah. Oh,
change.
I mean, Robin and I were discussing that earlier today. As far as our language, our
Mhm.
linguistic, the words that we choose, the words how we
Exactly.
categorize. You know, it, it
Exactly.
we know that words matter.
Yes.
We know that stand by or whatever. Stand down and stand by. We see the consequences of that.
Yes, indeed. Indeed.
We
Well,
see the consequences of not acknowledging another person's feelings when they are struggling because the images of a TV, another black male, or in this case another black female, murdered, and yet
mhm.
we're always looking for a rationalization or a justification
Yes.
why it happened, and we're never acknowledging the pain that communities face when they see it on a day-to-day basis.
True. Yep. I mean, this election year, we learned more about this racism
We're
and
learning a lot about
polarization.
ourselves. We're learning a lot about ourselves and where do we
Yes, we are
fall.
learning ours. That's true. Yes.
And I think that that's the key. We got to learn about ourselves as a nation. Look at the beautiful diversity in this room today. You look at
Yes.
the beautiful diversity of, you know, our profession.
Yes,
If
indeed.
we can't celebrate this diversity, be aware that we're not there yet. We're not there. We got a long way to go, but if not us, who, right?
True.
Our field is really the vanguard of all types of human right issues.
Exactly. True. Good. That your trip
Okay,
to Tulsa was very important, I think. That opened up your eyes more.
well,
And
I'm blessed. My students and being from Detroit, I've seen a lot over the course of the last 60 years.
true. Thank you. Thank you for this presentation. I
You're
think it should
welcome.
be presented all over our universities and students, faculty, everybody should know about this.
Agreed,
Yeah.
agreed. I have a question for you though.
Okay.
I have a colleague, and I've heard others say this, people I grew up with, that when you talk about the issue of privilege, which you covered really well, I have people who, especially white males, who'll say, you know, I don't have privilege, I grew up poor, or my family didn't leave me any land or inheritance. Everything I have, I work for, I struggled, so I don't have privilege. And I'm just really, it kind of blows me away. And it's really hard to get the point across. And I wonder if you have any perspective on how to.
Well, I mean, again, that's the first response. So what I would say is what you're describing is classism. What you're describing, there are a lot of poor white folks. And yes, they had to work their way through the system. We can't negate that feeling. But when you add, melatonin to the situation, when you're still white at the end of the day, and there's certain privileges that go with that that are really hard and subtle. It goes back to those microaggressions. And the best way I always describe it to my students who have that same question is, if myself and Robin, if you were male and you and I both walked into a elevator and an elderly white person came in, she's going to defer to me for safety, and I could be Jeffrey Dahmer, and you could be, Roy Rogers. But that's really an old reference. So you got many young people.
I'm familiar.
But but my point is, there's these certain subtleties. I mean, we don't. There are certain parts of the country where I could drive through and not have to. If I'm speeding, then I may have a second thought. But if you're driving through parts of the country that are sundown towns or other places where people get arrested for driving while black, and here's the difference. I mean, those are realities. Driving while black, working in this field as a Hispanic. I worked with migrant and seasonal farm workers. Dr. Candu remembers that grant we had at
Yeah.
Langston, where we'd go out into the fields. And the story is, okay, because of their ethnic background,
Yes.
Hispanic workers were afraid to go and get basic health care.
True.
And because they would be targeted by the police for and pulled over, even though they had all the documentation. But how many of us have to carry our birth certificates, our passports if we're working? Okay,
True.
so these folks we would avoid going to get help if they got hurt based on that premise of racism. Okay,
Yes.
and so we worked with we heard the story of a person that broke his ankle by picking watermelons in the field, and he refused to go in to get medical help
Ah,
until he ended up getting his foot amputated because it went
ah,
gangrene.
it's horrible.
And this was in Oklahoma. And the point being is, if he was white, he would never have had the thought about. He may not have been able to afford to get medical care, but they weren't going to turn him over. They weren't going to arrest him or follow him home and arrest his family. And
True.
so when people don't understand that yes, there are a lot of poor white. I mean, I'm not giving up my white card. What I'm saying is there's a responsibility of white America to understand that these systems exist. They're not just criminal justice. They're in education. Why does Robin have to, who graduated? I both graduate from the same school. Why would somebody question her competency and not mine? That's privilege. Okay. The other aspect of it, if I'm going to get a loan and Robin and I are competing for that same loan, and I get accepted and she doesn't because she's a black female, that's what
Subtle
white
thing.
privilege
Yes.
has done. And I think, yes, of course, when you have this conversation with people, they're going to be defensive because they don't understand it. So the first step is challenge them to dig a little deeper, to go to those pillars that I talk about. Empathy. Put yourself in another person's shoes. Okay? Put
Right.
yourself in another person's shoes and then have that conversation. I mean, I'm not playing gotcha with white folks. I'm trying to get us to get, I'm trying to bring us together. I'm trying to bring people together, not because not because it's, politically correct. No, it's morally correct.
I have a question for you. Apologize
Yes.
for not having my camera on. This is Araceli Holland, having troubles with my camera.
That's okay.
But to be fair, if it was working, this is probably not a day I want to be showing my face anyway. So, so in California, we are really working and addressing a lot of the inequities. And the more we dig, the more we realize there's more isms than I can ever name. I'm on a language access group and finding out that we have a linguicism that's new to me. That's just another layer of how we disenfranchise different populations. But as we're moving toward this, and we really are trying to build a movement of being accessible for everybody and embracing intersectionality and diversity, what I'm finding personally is forgive me, trying to be politically correct, but I want to break through this. We seem to be also dividing ourselves in that this is how Mexican Americans experience, and this is how we need to be treated, and this is the other experience. When really we need to be kind of coming together and finding a universal uh, expectation for mutual respect and access to everybody. So I'm glad to be having this conversation, but I'm trying to pull us all together to have one conversation. And just curious as to what if you have any thoughts or ideas about how do we promote a more inclusive language for everybody? How do I get us all working together and not against each other so that we can together make a bigger impact?
I think it starts with those pillars. I mean, if you're going to jump right into it, let's start with the conversation of what is compassion. Then let's move to empathy. Then let's move to, idealism or hope. And so that's that universal. That's that universality that we're looking for. We don't want to build. I always say, stop building silos around each other's experiences.
Yes.
We need to build a bridge to each other, because silos will go empty. But if you have a good relationship with your neighbors, then we'll never not want go without. Let me put that clearly. We'll never want, because our neighbors will step up because we've stepped up for them in the past. So if you go jump into these trainings about, we're going to talk about racism, you already got the fences built up around
Mm-hmm.
that, and so that if you start by talking about universal, universal language of compassion, of empathy, and practicing it. And what does that mean? Then give examples of how you can extend that and to address some of these other more hot button isms. That's not a bad place to start. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Dr. Sasson, thank you so much. We did have a comment from Eric in New Mexico asking about your PowerPoint, and I did say that we would be providing a copy to everyone.
Okay, cool.
That's okay with you to share?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
He also said that he wishes he could provide this training to all staff in his state, and that's New Mexico. So
I love, hey, just throw a little green chili, and I'm there, man.
there you go. And it definitely can happen, Eric. So
yeah, I'm seriously, I don't mind having these conversations with anybody that will put up with my tangentiality,
And also from Deborah, that she said so much to learn and feel, really understand others in their background and experience. Great presentation that you're getting from comments in the chat. Eric said there's plenty of green chili sauce for sure. So.
I know, we got to open up, we got to get there. We got to practice good safe.
Yeah.
We got to practice, got to wear that mask.
Yeah.
No, I mean, honest, without bringing light, there is a need. I mean, when we start watching, going back to earlier comment, we got to start looking at this world from a variety of different perspectives. I mean, there is so much pain and suffering that all of us in this we've endured. But to be the oppressor, you always ultimately are the oppressed because you're killing your own soul. And I think we've got to figure a way to have these conversations. I mean, we're talking amongst friends here, right? We're talking about people that have a shared value system. Generally speaking, we do make mistakes, and it's and we do perpetuate some of these microaggressions not out of consciousness. So we got to, first of all, we got to get our own act together. But then I think we need to expand it to have these dialogues with people in that are making these decisions, who are redlining cities, who are designing bus routes that leave off African Americans in North Tulsa so they can't get down to South Tulsa where all the jobs are. I mean, those are things that we need to have that conversation with these powers in these systems that exist, that they may not see the results of their actions because they're not looking at it from an empathetic or compassionate perspective. So I think that's where we got to start, is teach that compassion. Compassion to me is a lot more stronger than anger. Compassion is a lot more of a badge of courage than picking up, and attacking other people. It takes more guts to be a Gandhi or a Mandela than it takes to be a militia member. And so that was politically charged. I'm sorry, but that's the reality, guys. So that's where we start, is extending our humanity and extending our compassion, and not in such a touchy feely way that you sound like you should be in off picking daisies, from a realistic economic way. You know, appeal to the audience that you're working with. If you're addressing business people, talk about the business of 56 million Americans with disabilities are buyers and consumers too, right? If you're
Yes.
talking to a politician, remind them who voted them in. So these are things that we have to be out of our comfort zone to start talking, or we're never going to address these things until we start having these conversations, not just with ourselves, but with others too.
Also, there was a comment from Devin Puente that said we need to erase the line that creates the concept of the other.
Yeah,
Yes. Yes.
that's a good ask. That's a big ask, but you're right. I mean, it's like, what is it, like disability groups, right? They're only there for those labels are man-made. They only exist because it's some system that we use to segregate each other by those labels, right? And so he's spot on that comment.
Any other comments or questions? You're free to mute your microphones if you want to share, if you don't want to type it in your chat box. I know we are in our break right now, but have a few minutes before our next session begins. So if any other comments.
Robin, I had a comment. This is Devin. Um, I just really appreciate this presentation, Dr. Sasson. I feel like this could be very applicable to our department in California. I think it put heavy information in a clear, concise way. And I think a lot of trainings that I go to as far as diversity and inclusion and cultural competency and cultural sensitivity, the way it's organized is too much to consume at one time. But I feel like the way that this presentation was laid out was easier to consume than.
Well, Devin, you don't know how I appreciate that, because I've really been always accused of being too tangential. So thank you so much.
I think that book that you referenced, so you want to talk about race. Um, I'll have to put that here in the chat. Yeah. So that seems to be a lot of where you drew some of your information. And I
Yeah,
think
that and Sue's work, and plus just there's a lot of good material out there. That's what I'm saying. If you care, you do the research. You start reading. I tell my students, if you want to learn about something, obviously you got to read, but read beyond the textbook, read beyond what we assign. There's a lot of good books out there that really address these issues from a more personal perspective versus just, our normal mode of dissemination of information. But I really appreciate all of you guys hanging in there. It's nice to meet some of you, Devin and others, and
Thank
to
you,
see old
John.
friends.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a
Yes, it
great
is.
presentation. It's good that we are having this
Yeah.
conversation.
Take it home.
So,
Have it with
yeah,
your family.
yes. Have it with your
Yes.
coworkers, your friends. Start a book club, I would say, with
Well,
this
I,
book.
I
So you
tell
want
you
to talk
what,
about,
there's a
right?
lot. Yeah, I tried to start a book club up in Tulsa, but then the pandemic hit, and yeah. But there's a lot of great material out there.
So your contact information, we'll email
Okay.
that out to
Yep.
everyone, unless it's already in the PowerPoint, in case they want to follow up
Yes,
with
that'd be
you.
great.
Yeah, I think
Again,
it'll be have your contact information at the end of the PowerPoint so people can review and then can ask questions.
Okay.
In fact, I'd like
Yeah.
to talk to you about this in the future.
All right, you guys. Well, I
Okay.
appreciate you all. Have a great conference. Robin,
Thank you.
good job.
Bye.
Appreciate
All right,
you.
bye,
Have a
everybody.
great day.
Bye.
Welcome. Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hello to everyone. I am so happy to see everyone, even though I'm seeing mostly icons with 2020 and all that's happened this year. Just the fact that everyone's still 6 feet above ground, we're doing good. We're doing great. So I'm going to go ahead and to begin. First of all, Robin, thank you. Robin knows how much I love and appreciate her and just have a respect for her desire to elevate training and to be willing to deploy creativity and innovation and know that those are valuable components of training. Education alone is not power. And I would like to say hello to John and so many others that I familiarized myself with since the last training in New Orleans. We had a fantastic time. And so truly, I believe that we'll have a great time again today. This, of course, I'm going to give a disclaimer, is like none other training. So I'm expecting you guys to participate as much as possible. I've published a few books since our last meeting together and done some traveling until unfortunately we were shut down by COVID-19. However, I've done some training with some rehabilitation professionals, making sure that we understand that just because we're in a pandemic and we're in different times, it's no excuse for us to be creative and innovate. And today we're going to really talk about organizational communication. How can we communicate within our organizations to really make an impact? So be ready to be challenged, hopefully to be stirred up. Hopefully you'll laugh a little bit and maybe, just maybe, I'll get some folks in the chat who'll be willing to participate and answer a few questions. So with that being said, let's dive in today. So we're going on a trip and I would like to know, without you knowing where we're going, some of you all utilize the chat, but where we're going is not going to be disclosed. What would you take? If you don't really know where you're going, but if I said today, pack a bag, we're out of here, no masks required. Woo, that's party time right there. That's party time just right there. What would you pack? What would you take? Where would you go? Do I have anybody who's willing to step into the chat box and just let me know what would you take? I see the chats kind of lighten up. Somebody said money and a toothbrush. Okay, somebody else join in the chat. You don't know where we're going, but tell me something that you would like to take besides a mask. Okay, my medication, smart person. Someone else, you don't know where we're going, but we're going on a trip. Oh, that was sweet. Devin said my dog. Okay, let me hear from a few more people. Just hop into the chat. I was thinking to myself, what would I take? I'm not really sure, especially if I don't know where I'm going, but it's been announced that I'm going on a road trip. Okay. All right, tons of different clothing, clothes, underwear, makeup items, absolutely makeup, of course. Somebody was smart and said debit card and clothes. Let's get a few more people. My wallet and passport. Somebody's expecting to go out of the country. All right. Eric Padillo says some clothes for all occasions. Money will be good. Sunglasses, some tunes, snacks, a silk scarf to wrap my hair up at night. Money, clothes for each season, including high heels. High heels are year-round, folks. Journal and writing tools. Come on, you guys, let's interact. It's the end of the day. Let's get stirred up here. One or two more people, tell me something that you might take. Okay, that was good. A camera. I thought that was good. Somebody, I was waiting on somebody to say cell phone. Who's going somewhere nowadays without your phone, right? All right, exercise clothes, phone charger is good. Deborah Patterson said music. So we're going on a trip. We don't know where we're going, but I've announced that we're going somewhere. Family, okay, someone said they would take their family. Okay, this is good. Food, no one said food. This is good. Anybody else want to share? Anyone else? Anyone else? All right, so let's get out of the chat here and let's look here. This is someone squeezing a bunch of stuff in a suitcase, not really knowing where they're going. Folks, this is how I pack. So for those of you OCD people, don't judge me on today. This is normally, I'm trying to cram everything I can. Why? Because I really don't know what to be prepared for. And especially if I don't know where we're going. I want you guys to follow me here. Because what we've done is we've said that we want positive communication. We want positive interaction and feedback. We want positive impact across all levels. But if we do not allow the individuals that we work with from senior management to hire those who are in a higher position, even to those who are our lateral and co-workers, even to our subordinates, if we say we're going somewhere and we don't tell them where we're going, are we adequately providing them the tools to be prepared for what they may encounter along the way? Okay, no, the answer is no. So I said when I first did this exercise, I would take a bathing suit and some sunblock. And then I found out, I pulled something out of a bag and it said I was going to Alaska. Well, what I was going to take, it sounded good until I found out where I was going. And so I'm going to mess with you a little bit today and kind of prick your minds. Do we know where we're going? Do we really know where we're going as agencies and as community organizations? Do we really know? COVID-19 has thrown us a detour. So it's time for us to sit down and say, wait a minute, I may not be as prepared as I thought, because where I thought we were headed, we're actually headed in a totally different direction. So if you're taking notes, I want you to write that down. Have I adequately communicated with those who I'm working with? Have I adequately shared that, hey, the route has changed? Let me let you know where we're going. Let me effectively communicate where we're headed, okay? This brings me to the wonderful, lovely strategic plans. This is normally how in agencies we communicate what we're doing. We come together at a retreat with lots of fatty snacks, and we get together and we shut ourselves in, and some people are awake and some people are asleep because we know what's coming, right? We know that we're going to divide and we're going to get charts and graphs, right? We know all the things that's coming, but more than anything, nobody really wants to say that we're probably going to put a bunch of stuff on a whiteboard that nobody's going to do. So for the sake of us saying that we communicated as a team, we got our strategic plan together, have we really, really opened the door to real communication within our agencies, within our sectors? Are we really ready for communication apart from a whiteboard, apart from us bringing someone else in to help us facilitate our needs that we already know? Are we really ready to effectively communicate on another level? So this is normally what some strategic plans look like. For when I was working with Arkansas Rehab Services, it was this probably like on 8 to 10 pages, right? We discussed the change strategy and we discussed the plan, and all of these were good. Change management What's going to be our approach? Sponsorship, alignment. Okay. We also discussed stakeholder management and communication. Who are our stakeholders? And we might have stakeholders on the line today. Who are the people that are going to have to carry out the mission? Organization, workforce planning, skills, and even knowledge management. For many of you, these things sound familiar. We want to change. We want a strategy. We want a plan. We've got to involve stakeholders. But here's the important question. After we do all of this fantastic planning, have we really, truly, adequately communicated enough to change the culture and to change the environment where we work so that we can change the results and the outcomes? I would submit to you, most strategic plans fail for at least these 9 reasons. Number one reason that's not on here, our overarching theme, is for a lack of the ability to be able to communicate. But number one, having a plan simply for a plan's sake. And I want to challenge the framework of how we do business. If we're just having strategic plans and we're having meetings just to discuss the meeting that we just had to plan another meeting. Anybody experiencing that in COVID-19? Having a plan, but really not really planning to implement the plan. Someone said it's so true. Not understanding the environment or focusing on results. And of course, I am a results-oriented person, being that business engagement is my background. And those of us that say now business engagement is the order of the day, we need as agencies to communicate on a different level. Well, if we don't understand the environment and to really know that our focus is on results, well, you can't get results in 2020. You can't really measure outcomes in 2020 because, we're not at work. We're not able to see clients. I totally disagree. Until we include creativity and innovation as a part of our strategies, we will remain lost. Number 3, partial commitment. Our strategic plans fail because we do not have buy-in. And normally what I see is when someone brings me into their agency, either they prep me by saying, we know the type of trainer that you are. Don't open up the can of worms and ask people what are the real issues. Just want you to just kind of come in and give a little Easter speech, but we really don't want to know the problems because we really don't want to make any changes. Then I would submit to you, then don't ask me to train you. Part of the framework of who I am, part of my value system is to disrupt, to make sure that we're disrupting with a purpose. If our cultures are not producing any change, then what is the purpose of our culture? Even in the workplace. Number 4, not having the right people involved. Had a great manager, Rodney Chandler, phenomenal. And I was so blessed to have him as a manager and trainer. Why? Because he was a manager in the business world and very successful. And that's how he trained me. He made us read this great book, Going from Good to Great. And we often heard having the right people on the right seats on the bus, but can I submit to you that nobody's asking the question, are the people really on the right bus? Sometimes we rearrange seats and rearrange positions, but are you really on the right bus? Having the right people involved. May I submit to you as we discuss communication that the right people may not always agree with your strategic plan. It's good to have some individuals that are willing to challenge the status quo. Number 5, writing the plan and putting it on the shelf. Oh, don't enter into the chat room, but I would love to know how many people have spent times in retreats and conferences and got a notebook full of information that you did absolutely, positively nothing with. Number 6, an unwillingness or an inability to change. There is a difference between capacity and capability. We need both in order to be successful. Number 7, having the wrong people in leadership positions. Oh, shh. I wasn't supposed to say that out loud. I think you were just supposed to read that because that really starts to challenge some individuals. having the wrong people in leadership positions. Number 8, ignoring marketplace realities. This is so powerful. Do you all know and understand that this is such a great opportunity for us to communicate right now at a level that we've never communicated before? I recommended to one of the North Carolina had a huge rehabilitation summit a few months ago, right in the heart of COVID. And I was fortunate to be their series speaker for a series of events. And I challenged them to go back and begin to communicate and start to ask your internal customers as well as your external customers, are we marketing our clients now based on essential job functions? For all of those companies and corporations that said that they could not hire our clients because they had to lift, well, nobody's really working fully right now. Such a great opportunity for us to communicate through creative means. Ignoring marketplace reality will keep you stuck. Finally, why do strategic plans fail when we have spent hours communicating, no accountability, and no follow through? Somebody has to be responsible for taking the words off of the whiteboard and putting that into action. So let's talk effective communication. We need strategy. We need marketing. We need success stories that are not 5 years ago. We need right now on some of our websites, we need COVID-19 and pandemic success stories of how we were able to get clients employed, how we were able to increase, how we were able to gel together as a team. Do we have these things now on our current websites where we're communicating through the only means that we can right now are successes? Successes don't die because we're in a pandemic. More now than ever, if we're going to build an infrastructure of organizational communication, why not have some employee success stories? Why not some counselor success stories? How we were able to partner with community organizations in a pandemic. These are things that need to be a part of our communication strategy right now. Innovation, growth. And I'm going to share some innovative tactics of things that I believe that we can do to communicate better in this pandemic. I call it the chat and chew. So normally a chat and chew is where we go to a restaurant and we dialogue and we swirl some ideas around. I believe that the chat and chew is something that we can deploy in our agencies, which is now a creative tactic that we can use to communicate. So let's talk about it. So chat, the acronym chat, it's going to stand for, we're going to see how all think. See how all think. In order for us to communicate effectively, it is not enough for us to just have the opinion of the 17 disgruntled people in our agency or just the smeared over opinion of some senior managers. We need to see how all think. So if we've not deployed at this point some sort of internal communication to begin to ask our employees, hey, where are we right now? How are you? What tools do you need? What can we do to ensure success? If we have not deployed an outside survey to our business customers and our community partners, something that they can do on the computer, or here's a threat right here. What about a rehabilitation app? Something that your organization can partner and do something creative to begin to see how all think. How would you like now to be communicated with, since we cannot communicate through our normal means? Have we paused to even ask the question so that we can successfully communicate internally as well as externally? So we're going to chat. We've got to begin to see how all think. Watch this without threat. Without the threat of what we might hear, okay? So I'm gonna play a clip. It's about a minute long. And this, of course, is a play on when you don't know the right way to communicate and the importance of knowing your. This was just a play on how often we feel like we're listening and we're not. And we feel like that we are really showing the people that we serve internally as well as externally, that we're listening and communicating effectively, but we cannot adequately listen if we have not taken the time to realize who our real audience is. So who is your audience right now, internally as well as externally? When you don't know your audience, it hinders and it might set you up to never have an audience. And so for those of us who are going to communicate internally through an organizational structure, do I really know my audience? Am I really listening? Because listening translates information into action. So right now, who is your intended audience? Is that the counselor? Is that senior management? And I hear so many people tell me, they sidebar and they send me paragraphs of emails. Our infrastructure is not set up for us to share. Our infrastructure is really only set up for the higher management to be successful. I've got so many complaints that no one is hearing, or I've got so many great ideas that we could do to implement to help us to be more successful, but no one is listening. So today, as we discuss organizational communication, communicating from within, I want you to ask yourself the question, have I identified who my intended audience is? Now, in the hilarious video, the clip that I just showed, he was getting ready to make a pitch to women. So they were trying to train him that you may need to tweak what you say and how you say it based on who you're marketing to. That's a pause there, because if we have a one-size-fits-all communication method, we're setting ourselves up for intended failure within our organizational structures. So who is our intended audience? I have to go back to one of the trainings that I attended that actually sounds a little heartfelt and emotional, but it truly did change the way that I view communication. And this is it's not about a personality assessment, but I learned something when Arkansas Rehab Services sent me to Florida to become an international trainer for DISC and values. I said, it's just another personality assessment. I was truly challenged with the corporate executives that were there in the training with me that are now allowing their senior managers to go through a DISC and motivator training and to deploy their profiles on their office doors in the line of their email, so that their employees and other managers know how to effectively communicate with them for adequate results. And what I'm finding is within our organizational structures, we still feel that it's a one-size-fits-all. But do you actually know your intended audience and how they receive communication? So the DISC structure is the D, the I, the S, the C. Many of you have heard of this, but I was amazed to find out how many businesses are using this structure to improve their bottom line. They're using it for interviews. They're using it to interact with other business professionals. And if we're still sending an email, hoping that someone will be able to translate based on me being the sender and them being the receiver, folks, we are light years behind. We can literally shift a culture by knowing the intended audience. So, without taking an assessment, I want you to take a look here at this screen. Because in order for us to communicate effectively, I must know who I'm communicating with. If I am the D, am I direct, decisive, a doer? And when I get in the basement or the stress level of my communication, do I become domineering and demanding? In just a moment, I'm going to allow you all an opportunity to hit the chat and let me know where you feel like you land. The I. This is some person that's inspirational, interactive, interesting, but when they get stressed, especially in the workplace, they become impulsive and borderline irritating. The S, are you the steady person? You go along to get along. So if we're in a brainstorming session, you're just going to agree. You are the victim of groupthink, but you're also stable and supportive and sincere. But when you're under stress, you're slow and sensitive. And finally, the S. These are our policies and procedures, people. Are you cautious and careful, conscientious? But when you get stressed, do you become calculating? Do you save every single email so that you can put together an attack mode if necessary? Are you condescending? So I want everyone to hit the chat right now. Let's find out, what audience are we working with here today? Do you believe that you receive communication as a D, an I, an S, or a C? And I challenge you not to go based on a previous assessment. Evaluate who you have become as a result of COVID-19 and how you're having to do business under different circumstances. I'd love to take a moment right now and hear from each of you who are willing to share. Where do you think you land? So let's hit the chat. Let's hit the chat. All right. All right. Dominant, steady. Okay, stable. So we've got steady. Somebody said they're a DC hybrid, and I love it. You got the dominant and the C. Okay, we've got dominant. I want to hear from you guys because I'm going to tie this in just a moment with how this will influence you in the organizational structure. It depends on what is communicated, okay? Someone else, my top two, I think I was 1 point away. I think I was 51% dominant and 49% influential, okay? Anyone else, okay? Priscilla says she's dominant, influential, a hybrid. Maybe one or two more people share. Where do you feel like you land? While you're preparing your answer now, I want you to hit the chat and let me know, where is your senior management? Where do you feel like your senior management is? Okay. Jane says, I'm interactive, I'm a doer. Okay, someone else says, it depends on the audience that I'm communicating with. Someone else says, I'm a D, an I, and an S. But now I want you to hit the chat. Where do you feel like either your senior management is or the majority of the individuals that you work with? Take a moment right now. Someone said dominant for senior management. See, this is important. We want to communicate. We want to share our vision, our goals. We want to plan strategically, but do we know the intended audience? I'd love to hear from you. All right, steady, inspirational, dominant, influential. So far, the dominant for senior management is dominant. I'd love to hear what you think. Someone else said cautious. What do you feel your senior management is? Okay, another dominance coming in. Anyone else? Why is this important? Because if we want to communicate from an organizational structure perspective, then I have to begin to ask myself the question of who is my intended audience? Because if my intended audience is to reach someone that's dominant, I might need to not change who I am, but I might need to change or make some adjustments to the way that I communicate. If the intended goal is change, then is it just for me to get off of my chest what I need to share or my ideas? Or is change actually the intended goal? If so, then am I really looking at the individuals that I'm communicating with? Someone else said influential. Chat also stands for to see how all talk. To see how all talk. If I'm going to chat within my organization, why am I threatened by sometimes hearing the feedback of other people? Why do you feel that others talking and sharing within an organizational structure, why do you perceive that some people feel that as a threat and not as something being solution oriented? Anyone bold enough to answer that question in the chat? Why? Why do we struggle within our agencies with communication? Okay, chat's lighting up. Okay. Insecurity is one. Someone else said someone outshining another. Boy, the comments are coming in. Someone else said it might be used against you. That's good. Someone else said some feel being attacked personally as a result of them sharing, outshining another person. Do you all see what I mean by the importance of knowing how to communicate so that we can get these answers and address them? 50% of management is cautious, 50% micromanages, especially during COVID. I definitely feel it would be looked at as confrontational. So we keep saying we want organizational structure. So we're going to get somebody to come in. We want better communication. We're going to get on a whiteboard. But are we really prepared to make the changes that are necessary for us to go into another direction? Someone else says egos get in the way. Someone else says it's a controlling environment. So if we're hearing the feedback, then for those of us that are change agents, that have apparently had lunch, and some of us may be sluggish and might be tired, but I do want you to ask yourself the question, if I'm a change agent, then what am I willing to do to change the way that I communicate internally so that we can seek and get a desired outcome? I see a lot of people saying egos are in the way. Fear, someone else said it's fear of confrontational. So when we begin to chat and change how we communicate, we have to be willing to see how all talk and not be threatened by an opinion that is not necessarily in line with ours. Okay, someone says slowly over months, management is realizing how much heart many of us are putting into teleworking with clients and outcomes are improving. That's phenomenal. Someone else said yes. So in order for us to communicate, we've got to be willing to see how all talk. And not just within the agencies, but externally as well. Thank you guys for your feedback. Very good response on that one. So if I'm communicating, what's my definition of success? I want everyone right now to either write on a piece of paper or put in the chat something that you feel like you would love to communicate, and what is your desired outcome? Would you love to say, hey, I've got a great creative idea and this is the desired outcome? What is your definition of success? I'd like everyone to take a moment and do that now. What's something you want communicated? Be willing to share it in the chat. See, the chat is already lighting up. And what is your desired outcome? What does success look like for you? Okay. Deborah said her idea of success is really to open up someone's mind about ability. Someone else said productive measures and working on morale within the agencies. Someone else said inclusion. Okay, I hear new training programs and great buy-in. See, until we know our intended audience and what is our idea of success, then we'll spend a bunch of time filling whiteboards, but we're not getting any outcome to accomplish a common goal. What's sticking out to me is the new training program and great buy-in. Then what should that new training program look like? What is my idea of great buy-in? Because until we decide and stop saying, hey, I just want great buy-in, now zero in. What does that look like? 50% participation, 60%? What does that look like so that I can effectively communicate? Someone else said to remove the walls of misunderstanding through open and real conversations. That was a phenomenal answer. To make the workforce system more cohesive among all workforce partners and co-managing participants. That's very good. Opening the lines of communication. No matter the mode of how I'm working, if I am finding ways to reach clients and impact their lives, I feel like that's a success. But what I love is the individuals who are sharing their comments and saying, hey, this is something I would like to see communicated, but then this is my definition of success. What I don't want you to do is to start going through the robot and the motions of just being in your agency. If you had the microphone, what would you say? If someone gave you 60 seconds to improve the quality of the workforce in the agency, and it doesn't mean your agency has to be bad, what would you say if you were handed the opportunity to communicate? What changes would you make? If you haven't done it already, write it down. Circle it 3 times as a symbol to yourself that I still have a voice and I still believe that change is possible. Thank you so much to everyone who joined me in the chat. What are some of the hindrances? Because this is what I get, especially from Voc Rehab, more than any other entity that I train, is I'm speaking, but nobody's listening, or there's a punishment if I speak. So you've got the sender, you've got the receiver, but you've got noise in the middle. So I'm going to ask the question right now. This is the guy, he was with Sprint. I don't know who he's with now. He keeps changing phone companies. I really can't keep up with him. But he asked the important question that even toddlers know, can you hear me now? And this is what I am finding, that a lot of rehab professionals and community organizations, even in the business world, they really feel like they're not heard. I've stressed my ideas, but I don't feel like my ideas are heard and respected. Well, I want everybody to enter the chat or write this down. 1 or 2 things that you feel like is the noise. What do you feel like is hindering the flow of communication? What's the noise? Let's identify the noise. Okay, the chat's already lighting up. I want honest responses. Oh, the chat is blowing up. Okay, here we go. Regulation, okay. Budget, busyness, that's a great one. Sometimes I'm listening, but can't get clear message, okay? So ambiguity in the messages. Metrics prioritized over people. I love that you guys are participating in the chat. Someone else, what do you feel like is the noise? If you feel like you're here and you're there and you're asking the question, can you hear me now? What is the noise? Anyone else willing to share? Anyone else? What do you feel like the noise is? And you know, after a while, someone else said too many hats and duties. But can I suggest, after a while, somebody that continues to speak that feels like they're not heard, what do you think they do? They stop speaking. They shut down. Decisions being made without any employee input, closed doors to decision makers, lack of awareness and education, misunderstanding the questions that are asked. You guys are really expressing today. But folks, can I tell you, these things don't make it to a whiteboard. These are not the things that we're seeing in our strategic plans. And in order for us to really shift and change the culture, and me to mess with you just a little bit and say, hey, are we walking around with a smile, but we're like the clown that's got the smile, but a lot of people have the tear. We're displaying one thing, but what can we do to alleviate the noise so that we can better communicate within our agencies? And folks, asking these questions does not mean that we're failing. Actually, asking these questions sets us up for greater success. Okay? Someone else says, failure to identify emotions of those individuals that are on your team. Thank you to everyone that hit the chat right there. I'm getting some great responses. So again, we asked the question, what would you identify as the noise? If you haven't already shared, I'd like for you to do that now. Anyone else know any of the noise? What about the pressure of performance? No one put that down. The pressure of perfection, the pressure of performance, closed-mindedness. Because we must take into consideration that you're not just communicating, but there is a filter between you and the receiver. What is the white noise that is stopping us from communicating effectively and being successful? All right. So let's talk organizational communication. This is the process by which individuals stimulate meaning in the minds of other individuals by means of verbal and nonverbal messaging in the context of a formal organization. So what is formal? What is formal? Communication that follows the chain of command. We've heard this. Informal. What is informal communication? Communication that is not defined by the organizational structure. Most of us have experienced formal communication, But I would love to give you guys a few creative tidbits as I prepare to begin to wind down and ask for questions as to how we can communicate better, but it may not be inside the box. So let me give you a few suggestions. Of course, we've got vertical communication, we've got horizontal, we've got the grapevine. All of these are organizational structures of communication, but these are not what I want to focus on. Let's have a real conversation. Do you know that employees will support the change that they help to create? This is a powerful statement here. So if I'm communicating and I want to see change, I must make sure that the other stakeholder has a buy-in, there's that word again, into the change that I'm willing to implement. It cannot just be about me. It must include something in the communication that is a with them, if you will. What's in it for me, for the other person? What is the buy-in? How will they buy in to this policy, to this training, to what I need to share and to say? 3 things we've got to do. Stripping down all of the strategic plans. If we can do these 3 things, folks, we've hit a home run. Number 1, information comes from the root word to inform. Making sure that in our communication, we are informing and providing the necessary information for the person that we're expecting to respond to make an informed decision, not just based on emotion. What is the information? I go back to the DISC and values chart, especially if your senior management is a C and a D. Write this down. You must make sure that you are bullet pointing the information, referring back to policy and how what you're sharing can positively affect policy and procedure. Because if you just communicate from an emotional perspective, you have lost the senior management that's a D and a C. You have lost them. If you have a senior management that is an I, then guess what? Your communication for change needs to make sure that it has something inspirational in it. Attach a success story to it. Attach a positive video. But if you go to that person and you're just bullet pointing and you're just giving them policies and procedures with no heart, you've lost that person. That is why knowing your intended audience is so important. I highly recommend that the agencies go back and get some additional training on how to send and receive communication, and then rewrite the strategic plan and see the difference between the strategic plan that we wrote when we were not hearing each other and the strategic plan that we now know how to communicate with each other effectively. So this is a great quote by Peter Drucker. Quality in the service or product is not what you put in it, it's what the customer gets out of it. Now, when I say communication and product, I'm using those interchangeably for just a moment. Often, when we want to communicate within an agency, I've been a mediator, I've done it all within the agency. And you know what I've found is that most people spend the majority of the time trying to get their point across and less time trying to make sure that your recipient gets something out of what's said. So I'm going to say it again. The quality of even what we have to say is not just the effort that we put in it, but it's how the individual, the other individuals, the receivers, how do they receive what we've shared and what is our intended goal for them to receive out of it. Idea number 1, a virtual town hall. A virtual town hall. If you and your organizational, whether you are a community partner or whether you're a smack dab in the middle of voc rehab, in this COVID-19 environment, we cannot shut down the lines of communication, but we must be willing to deploy creativity and innovation. A virtual town hall, if we have not done it, it needs to be done. Town hall is where you hear, you give information, it's a sharing. It may have to be guided and mediated so that it's not a gripe session, but really a virtual town hall really shows the other individuals that I'm communicating with that I'm willing to listen to the things that you have to say and be willing to tweak some things for my intended audience. I perceive a virtual town hall would not hurt with business customers and would not hurt with clients. Oh, the clients are going to whine and complain. Some of my greatest times of stretching and growth have been hearing words of criticism from those who may not have meant it to be positive, but I chose to receive it and make the necessary adjustments. So I submit that a virtual town hall would be something great, something out of the box, a creative approach for us to really hear and to gain some ideas. Someone's hit the chat. Let's see what we have to say. All right. Someone said, great idea. Thank you. Because until we begin to know that creativity cannot stop because we're in a COVID-19 environment, this is more than anything. This is a great time for you to deploy different strategies to hear from individuals. Thank you. So if we're going to change the culture, I want to give you a few things. Number one, it doesn't end with leadership. It starts with leadership. No, it's got to be grassroots. No, I totally disagree. But we must also give the leaders the flexibility to say these words, we don't know. And unfortunately, a lot of us, we feel that our leaders should have all the answers. I don't know why you don't know. If we want effective communication within our agencies, leadership should also have the liberty and the freedom to say, we don't know. However, we're willing to get a focus group together so that we can adequately find the answer, starting with leadership. Secondly, decision-making and structure. We must design decision-making processes to support a desired culture, not undermine it. And this hurts the group of complainers because there's nothing wrong with giving feedback, but attach a proposed solution to your feedback. And notice what this says. We're building a decision-making process to support a desired culture, not an apparent culture, but a desired culture. So we can no longer continue to communicate based on a culture that we know needs to change. So now I deploy decision-making strategies and build a structure that already includes the changes that I would like to see. Number three, the people. Of course, we've stated, ensure the right people are on the bus and remove obstacles if necessary. Align measures and desired strategy. This means that it cannot just stay on a whiteboard. Who is going to carry this wonderful idea out? I had one vocational counselor say, I dread an email that comes from the top because normally it's laced with a bunch of ideas whereby nobody's thought about who has to carry it out. Folks, we don't want to build that sort of culture. We want to be able to have an organizational structure where we can take the ideas and say, hey, this will work and here's why, or this won't work and here's why, but be willing to have at least a small amount of transparency so that those who have to implement the plan know the whys or the why nots. Finally, we have to engineer processes and systems to drive the desired behavior. I would love for someone to have a virtual retreat where we take our current strategic plan and really begin to ask ourselves the question, what if we implemented off of this plan? 2, since COVID-19, has anyone had the brilliant idea that we might just need to take our strategic plan and redo it? Or are we just going along to get along because it's on a piece of paper? We need to reevaluate our plans and change how we communicate. To me, one of the number one things, we should be having virtual career fairs right now. Is anybody talking about it? Virtual town halls. Is anybody talking about it? Featuring a virtual business customer of the month, that something is disseminated within the organization to keep up morale. What are we doing to influence the communication culture? Another creative idea is a live chat. And someone says, this is scary because we don't know what people are going to say. Folks, let me say this. If we continue to walk around as if we don't have agencies full of frustrated people, we will have no change. We will have no change. If we keep walking around and we're ignoring the elephants in the china cabinet, we will have no change. So how do we disseminate change without undermining the work that leadership has done to the best of their ability to build up the agencies? We must be creative. A live chat, a focus group. Get some of the counselors that you know are not that happy. Get some of the ones that are. Build a focus group of individuals that are creative. Deploy the DISC and motivator strategy. Find out those individuals where creativity is their niche. Mix the team together. And instead of us putting a bunch of stuff on a whiteboard that we're not going to do, get that focus group together and do a live chat. You may not be able to do it with everyone, but let someone represent the different sectors that are represented within your agency or your community. Let's talk. Let's chat. Let's see how all talk. Let's see how all think. So the chat and the chew. The chew part of the communication is we must be willing to allow information that's communicated to be absorbed and digested. And I think this is what hurts the sender, is the waiting. But we must know, not just as the receivers, but as the senders, that there has to be some filtering of information. But we must teach people that information has to be digested. We must be clear about what needs to be done. Develop clear messages. Is this message clear for the senior management or the lateral person that I'm working with? Have I ensured that the information is adequate, accurate, and correct? Go back here for just a minute. After communicating the information, what do I expect? Whether it's from my employees or whether it's from my coworkers, whether it's from those who I'm managing, whether it's from other subordinates, what do I expect? I call this the bullseye method. If you know the bullseye, you got one circle in the center, and then you've got other circles that are on the outside. Most of us in the area of organizational communication, we're on the outskirts. We must be willing to hit the bullseye of communication and find out, what do we really expect? And not only what do we expect, but what do you expect of me? What key pieces of information are needed? Now, we say it's time for change, right? Everybody, we want change, we want change. And I think it's awesome that we all want change. But I have now deployed, and hopefully by the end of the year, my patent will be complete. But I've now marketed what's called the do it method. The do it method. The D in do it stands for the dreamers. Every single organization needs to be able to deploy the do it method. You have your group of your big thinkers. They have a place in your agency and in your organization. And some people say, oh, I hate the ideas people. But you need the big ideas people. You need someone to say virtual town hall. You need someone to say a virtual business customer of the month. Guess what? I'm a big thinker. This is who I am. But you need these individuals on your team. Begin to build focus groups based off of the do it method. So you need the big ideas. What else do you need? You need you need the observers. Once we get the idea, we must be willing to take it through the do it method in order to really see results. Okay, you've given us a big idea. Now we need to take a small group, put that idea with a few tweaks into operation, but we need somebody to be able to observe. Okay. We need the implementers. These are the people that are going to make sure that the idea gets done. So I've got my dreamers, I've got my big thinkers. They need to be at a seat at some communication table. I need the observers. I need those steady people that can look at the lay of the land. I need those S's and those C's to say, hey, this is a good idea, but this is against policy. But what if we tweak this? What if we add or take this away? We need the observers. Then once it's gone through the D and the O stage, we need somebody that's willing to be the implementers. Who will be the boots on the ground people to implement this process? And finally, a lot of teams stop with the I. They have the big thinkers, they have the people who are to observe, and they have the implementers, but there's nobody to track the progress. This is where we fail. And the trackers are your C's. These are your compliant individuals, or these are your individuals that love research and results. But if we keep putting ideas on whiteboards, but we don't have a people to carry it out, and we don't have a method to track it, guess what? It will not be sustainable. And sustainability is critical. And it's not just enough for us to say that we came together, but what can we do now to sustain? We got the big idea, virtual career fair, virtual town hall, big idea. Now, who is going to be the person to maybe see who's done it already and to observe and make the tweaks? Then who are going to be the people responsible for getting this virtual town hall together? Who are the implementers? And then who is going to take the results, good, bad, ugly, or indifferent, collect the data, and then we start the method all over again by being able to take those results and beginning to effect change. Every organization and communicational structure needs tracking. You need the dreamers, observers, and implementers. So folks, I want to ask today, open the floor for any questions or for you to share, hit the chat. What are some key takeaways from this webinar today? What did you gain? What did you hear? Or you might just say, I got an opportunity to vent. Tell me if you have any key takeaways from the webinar. If not, I'm just going to assume I did a fantastic job. That's what I'm just going to assume I did a great job. But I'll entertain questions right now. Any questions, comments? Okay. Someone said, I love how you use the DISC in different areas of training. Absolutely. DISC is critical. I highly recommend the DISC for anyone that's in an organizational structure. All right, thank you. I like the quote. Anyone else? It takes humility to be an effective communicator. Pamela says you've given some ideas to take to the table. Excellent, excellent. And remember, when we go to the table, we're going to the table, making sure that we've looked at and researched who is our audience. Okay, town hall, 2 thumbs up. There are many takeaways from the day. The key is open lines of communication and knowing our audience. Wonderful. Deborah, you're always a joy to listen to. Takeaway from this webinar is doing more thinking about inclusion of all stakeholders. Absolutely excellent. Anyone else?
Ashley, this is Araceli. First of all, I remember you from the last one. That's why I made the high heels remark. Thank you very much.
Yes.
But this is very timely for me because we've started our strategic planning twice now, and twice I've kind of just walked away thinking, okay, this isn't happening the way I'm envisioning it, because I'm trying to build a strategic plan from the bottom up. I want to be able to have our individual teams generate what is important to them and to bubble it up to us, so then we can incorporate that whole strategic planning. But I'm wondering if you have any suggested resources for how to do that. I have 2 managers under me. So how do I help facilitate that communication so that I am, because I hear you, there's no point to me having a strategic plan if nobody's going to follow it.
Absolutely.
And I completely hear you when you say, you know, if they build it, they're going to buy into it. So how do I go about doing that so we can build a good one?
This is a great question. One is I would allot for, even if it's 30 minutes or an hour, I'm really going to challenge you here, is to give them something that's going to inspire creativity. For example, with some agencies who ask me to assist with strategic plans, I always tell them, okay, you have no budget, what would you do? And everybody's like, oh, we always have a budget. but some of the best creative ideas have come by beginning to take the mental limits off of the individuals to allow them to really just be able to say, oh, I would love to be able to do that. And then someone from senior management saying, well, hey, that's actually doable. We may be able to tweak it within these confines, but giving your two managers, those who are underneath you or your authority, to be able to give them the opportunity to at least to be creative. Two, open the lines of full communication open for them to feel that they can be transparent without confrontation and retaliation. That is important. Even if you set a timer, I've done this with certain groups, and set a timer and say, hey, for 5 minutes, you are you and I am me. For 5 minutes, no retaliation. I want you to open up the lines of communication and tell me, what do you feel like we need in order to be successful? What is a strategy for the strategy? Who are the people on the bus that are willing to carry this out? And then finally, I would say for you as a leader, before you do this with anyone else, do these things that I'm sharing with you. Take some time, because sometimes we get in the strategic meetings and we count on one another to kind of lead and lift. I would say, go back to the creative person, go back to a place of creativity and innovation and say, these are some ideas that maybe I had a few years ago or this year that maybe we didn't implement. I'm going to put them on paper, whether I know how they're going to be carried out or not, because it might be that you might have the first piece, but someone else might have the second piece. I see you came off of mute. Comments?
I was just going to say thank you. Those are very good suggestions. And I'm wondering if that 30 minutes, if that's the place where we could implement something like the focus groups or the live
Yes.
chats.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. You're very welcome. Robin, I'm going to turn it over to you if we don't have any more questions. Again, thank you so much, everyone. I hope and pray that there was some challenge in here, but you will not just say we attended a webinar or we attended another training. I would love to hear some takeaways and for Robin to be able to report back to me some virtual town halls and some successes. So again, thank you all so much. Robin, it's back in your hands.
Thank you, Ashley. Yeah, it was awesome. I like Pam's comment. She said, you are leaving an impression again, like no other. So thank you, Ashley. Great information, great presentation. We will again share the video from today's presentation. I think that the information is so rich, and that if you can share it with your directors and with your staff, that you're going to see many great benefits. And this is a great introduction to having a town hall or having focus groups. So hit Ashley up. We'll share her contact information if you want to go deeper with her, or she has it there on the screen for you. So thank you. It's it's a little, I can just barely see your email, so you might want to say that.
Okay. It looks like you changed
For
the colors
me,
on
it's in blue, so it's hard.
Yes, it's bebigonpurpose@gmail.com. And that's bebigonpurpose@gmail.com. Be big on purpose.
Put that in the chat. gmail.com. So you have Ashley's contact information. Please hit her up and keep the conversation going. She had a lot of great ideas. And I know when you have so much in your mind and in your heart that you want to implement, sometimes you need time to reflect on that. Right. And then you want to come back, hit the ground running on it. So she's a great resource. We encourage you to follow up with her and use her in your work with your agencies. Again, Ashley, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure having you here today. If there's nothing else, we want to again say to everyone, thank you for joining us today. Dr. Kundu, did you have any closing remarks?
Oh, it was powerful presentation. The only thing we need to think about it and sink it in our heart, particularly those who are in leadership position. You gave a really good channel how to navigate during this pandemic situation. We need to change our philosophy and how we communicate with our, vertical and parallel, all of this, that's most important. So good food for thought during this pandemic situation. Enjoyed it. We enjoyed it last year and also this year. Excellent. Excellent.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Dr. Kundu. I really like the information on re-examining your strategic plan.
Yes.
It's
True.
so important right now, so that we don't get into this rut of just putting out fires or doing business as usual, that it's so important that we are constantly examining how
Changing.
we can do better.
Exactly.
Looking forward to tomorrow and your participation. Join us at 2 for a presentation on social media. We will share this recording again and post it on our Project E3 website and email it out to all the participants. Again, thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your evening and stay safe.
Thank
Blessed
you.
evening.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.